Yes, students, good morning. Today we are going to discuss the topic of ear diagram, uh, how to draw the ear diagram. So, what are the basic concept in the ear diagram in DBMS? So, this is ear diagram is a model used for designing representation of relationship between the data. So, the main data objects are termed as entities with the details defined as attributes. Some of these attributes are important and are used to identify the entity, and different entities are related using relationship. In short, to understand the ER model, we must understood about entity set, what are attributes and type of attributes, keys and relationship. So today I take the example of school management software. How to store student information, teacher information, classes, subjects taught in each classes. Now, ER model, there is an entity and entity set. Considering the above example, student is an entity, teacher is an entity. Similarly, class subject also entities. An entity is generally a real world object which has a characteristic and holds relationship in a DBMS. If a student is an entity, then the complete data set of all the students will be a entity set. So student is an entity. Then complete data set of all the students will be the entity set. So ஒரு ஸ்டூடெண்ட் இருக்காருங்க அந்த ஸ்டூடெண்டோட என்டிட்டி ஸ்டூடெண்ட் சம்மந்தப்பட்ட அத்தனை என்டிட்டி அத்தனை டேட்டாஸ் எல்லாத்தையும் சேர்த்தும் போது அது என்டிட்டி செட் அப்படின்னு நம்ம சொல்றோம். ஸோ ER model attributes. So ER model attributes அப்படின்னா if a student is an entity, then the student's roll number, student's name, student's age, student's gender, etc. will be its attribute. An attribute can be of many types. Here is the different types of attribute defined in ER database model. So simple attribute, composite attribute, derived attribute, single value attribute, multi-value attribute. So the simple attribute is cannot be broken further or simple attributes. For example, student's age. Composite attribute, a composite attribute is made up of more than a one simple attribute. That is address to contain the pin number, pin code, street name, house number. Derived attribute. These are the attributes which are not present in the whole database management system but are derived from using other attributes. For example, average age of students in a class. So single value attributes, as the name suggested, the attribute have a single value. As the name suggested, the attribute value is multi-values, that is multi-valued attribute. So here model keys, we already discussed in the previous video. What about the keys? There is we use here two, three keys only in ER model. There is one key super key, one is primary, one is candidate key. So now ER model relationship, when an entity is related to another entity, they said to have a relationship. For example, a class entity is related to student entity because students study in class ends. This is relationship. So depending upon the number of entities involved, the degree is assigned to a relationship. For example, if two entities are involved, it's said to be binary relationship. If three entities are involved, it should be ternary relationship. And Shuha. So how working with ER diagrams? So ER diagram is a visual representation of data that describe how data is related to each other. So in ER model, we disintegrated data into entities, attributes, and set up relationship between entities. All this can be represented visually using the ER diagram. For example, in the below diagram, anyone can see, understand what the diagram wants to convey. And developers develops a website, whereas a visitor visits a website. So here, this is the one common site website. So this website was developer create. At the same time, the visitor visits the website. So what are the components of ER diagram? The entity, attribute, relationship, etc. from the components of ER diagram. There are defined symbol and shape to represent each one of them. Let's see how we can represent each this in our ER diagram. The entity is a simple rectangular box representation and entity. Students, subject. This is a rectangular. The rectangular entity box, sorry, rectangular box is an entity. It's represent an entity. So relationship between entities, weak or strong. Rhombus is used to set up relationship between the two or more entities. So two or more entities. There is a relationship between entities we represent as using rhombus symbol in the weak and strong. There is a double rhombus symbol. There is a weak relationship. The single rhombus symbol is a, like a strong relationship. Next, attributes for an sorry, sorry. Attributes for any entity. Eclipse is used to represent attributes for an entity. It is connected to the entity. So author, data, publish, and book. So book is a entity. This book entity is the attribute is author and data publish. So we are represent these attributes using eclipse symbol. So weak entity. Weak entity is always like a rectangle is a normal strong entity. In double rectangle box, we say it's weak entity. A key attribute for an entity to represent a key attribute for an entity using this symbol. See here, there's the eclipse. Inside the eclipse, there is a one underline. That symbol we say key attribute for an entity. Derived attribute for an entities. Derived attributes are those which are derived based on the other attributes. For example, age can be derived from the date of birth. So to represent derived attribute, another dotted eclipse is created instead of main eclipse. Multi-valued attribute for any entity. The double eclipse, one side, one inside another, represent the attribute which can have multiple values. So composite attribute for an entity. The composite attribute is the attribute which also has attributes. So now ER diagram entity. So the an entity can be object, place, person, class. In a ER diagram, an entity is represented using rectangles. Consider an example of organization. Employee, manager, department, product, and many more can be taken as an entity in an organization. So employee works for a department. The hello numbers is between the relationship between represents the relationships. Weak entity is an entity. Weak entity is an entity that depends on the another entity. Weak entity does not have any key attribute of its own. So here is a weak entity does not have any key attribute of its own. Double rectangle is used to represent a weak entity. Here diagram attribute. So student is an entity. Student attribute is a name, address, age, ID. So an example here diagram. So now before that we are use attributes CR diagram. Now key attribute. So ID is a unique ID. The key attribute represented in the main characteristics of an entity. It is used to represent a primary key eclipse with the text underlined, a present key attribute. So here diagram composite attribute. An attribute can also have their own attributes. These attributes are known as composite attribute. So example, address. So inside of the address attribute, city, state, zip. These are the attribute of the address attribute. So here diagram relationship. So teacher teach subjects. So I go to related with teacher with the student. The teacher teaches student. There are three types of relationship that exist between entities: binary relationship, recursive relationship, ternary relationship. So these both three things we are discussing in the next video.